Welcome to No Name. There is a reason this channel has no name, because the stories here could belong to anyone, any road, any forest, any RV pulled over for the night. What you are about to hear are RV camping horror stories drawn from moments when travelers believed they were safe, only to discover that isolation changes the rules. These stories do not rely on monsters or myths, but on silence, distance, and the unsettling feeling of being noticed when no one should be there. Listen carefully, because when you travel far enough from civilization, names stop mattering, and survival becomes the only thing that does. The first knock came after midnight, not loud enough to wake the forest, just loud enough to wake my conscience. My name is Caleb Morgan. I was 38 that summer, and I had convinced myself that solitude was a form of clarity rather than a test. I grew up in western Colorado, the kind of place where mountains loom close enough to shape your thinking, where silence is familiar and danger is something you respect without dramatizing. I'd spent years chasing remote campgrounds in my aging Class C RV, trading hookups and crowds for dirt pull-offs and ranger maps folded thin as cloth. That particular trip took me into a high desert basin, straddling the edge of a national forest and Bureau of Land Management land, a place with no formal campground, no cell service, and a reputation that existed mostly in murmured warnings from locals who stopped talking when you asked follow-up questions. I parked just before dusk, leveling the rig on a shelf of gravel overlooking a dry wash. The air smelled like sun-baked sage and iron-rich dust, and the temperature dropped fast once the sun slid behind the ridgeline. I remember feeling proud of myself for choosing the spot, for trusting my judgment. There's a particular satisfaction in self-reliance when you camp alone, a belief that awareness and experience can substitute for company. I cooked inside that night, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the far-off yip of coyotes, telling myself that every sound had a place in the ecosystem, that fear was just ignorance wearing a costume. The first whisper came before the knock. It threaded through the thin walls of the RV like a draft, indistinct and low, a cadence without words. At first, I thought it was wind slipping through the wash, shaping itself around rock and scrub. Then I noticed the wind had died entirely. The night was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears until you become aware of your own breathing. I sat on the edge of the dinette, lights dimmed, listening hard enough that my jaw ached, telling myself that the mind fills silence with invention. When the knock landed on the side panel near the rear wheel well, my body reacted before my reasoning did. My shoulders tightened, my pulse thudded in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. It wasn't the sharp rap of a branch or the hollow clang of debris. It was deliberate. 3 measured taps spaced evenly, followed by nothing. I waited, counting seconds, feeling the RV settle under my weight. I didn't call out, I didn't reach for the door. I told myself that if it were an animal, it would move on, and if it were a person, they would announce themselves. Another whisper slid along the seam of the door, closer this time, like someone testing the sound of my presence without committing to it. I stood slowly and peered through the side window, careful not to cast a shadow. The moon was thin, just enough light to turn the desert into a map of grays. I saw no movement, no silhouette, nothing that justified the sudden certainty that I was being evaluated. That was the moment denial set in, the internal argument that keeps you from admitting you're afraid. I told myself that solo camping requires tolerance for ambiguity, that reacting too quickly can escalate nothing into something. The second knock came from the front, near the driver's door, a single tap this time, followed by a pause that felt intentional. I reached for the flashlight, my fingers slick with sweat, and clicked it on without opening the door, sweeping the beam across the ground through the windshield. Dust motes flared and vanished. The wash lay empty. The whisper returned, closer, resolving into fragments that might have been words if I wanted them to be. I thought of the stories I'd heard over the years, the ones about hikers who vanished between trailheads, about figures that mimicked human sounds to draw you out. I'd always filed them away as cautionary folklore, narratives shaped to keep people from getting careless. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat awake until dawn, cataloging every sound, every shift in temperature, every creak of the RV's frame. The cold seeped in before sunrise, a dry, penetrating chill that made my hands ache. When light finally spilled into the basin, the fear receded enough for embarrassment to take its place. In daylight, the desert looked harmless, even inviting. I stepped outside and walked the perimeter, scanning for tracks. There were prints near the rear tire that didn't match any animal I recognized, elongated impressions that suggested bare feet or poorly fitting boots. They circled the RV once and then headed toward the wash. I considered leaving then. Pride kept me there. I told myself that fear feeds on retreat, that if I packed up at the first unexplained event, I'd be surrendering to superstition. I spent the day hiking a nearby ridge, forcing normalcy into my routine. The sun was harsh, the rocks warm under my boots, and the silence returned, broken only by wind and distant bird calls. I felt foolish for having been rattled, and that feeling was dangerous. It smoothed over the edges of caution and replaced them with confidence. The smell hit me first that evening, a sour, organic odor that drifted in as the light faded. It reminded me of wet leather and something sweet left too long in the heat. I checked the undercarriage, the storage bays, even the generator compartment, convinced there was a practical explanation. There wasn't. The smell intensified after dark, thick enough to taste, and with it came the whispers again, clearer now, layered and overlapping. I could almost pick out syllables, fragments of speech that hovered just beyond comprehension. It felt intimate, invasive, as if the environment itself was leaning in to test my resolve. When the knocking resumed, it wasn't measured anymore. It moved around the RV, irregular and impatient, sometimes high on the wall, sometimes low, as if whatever made it were changing posture. Panic crept in, not as a spike, but as a steady climb, tightening my chest and narrowing my focus. I grabbed my keys and slid into the driver's seat, telling myself I'd idle the engine, make my presence known. The engine turned over with a roar that shattered the quiet, and for a moment the knocking stopped. Relief washed through me, followed immediately by dread when I realized the whispers hadn't ceased. They rose to meet the noise, weaving through it closer than before. I didn't see anyone when I pulled forward, headlights cutting across the wash, but I felt watched, tracked by something that didn't need to be visible to exert pressure. The RV lurched as I hit uneven ground, and in that jolt, I understood how thin the line was between confidence and vulnerability. The road out was little more than a suggestion, a pale ribbon that disappeared into shadow. As I drove, the smell clung to the interior, the whispers fading only when the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. I didn't stop until I reached a paved road hours later, heart still racing, mind replaying every moment I'd rationalized away. In the safety of daylight and distance, reflection set in, heavy and humbling. I thought about the hikers who'd never made it back, the stories I'd dismissed, and the way solitude can sharpen or dull your instincts depending on how you treat it. I learned that night that the wilderness doesn't announce its dangers with clarity or fairness. It presses, it probes, it waits for you to decide whether you're listening. I camped again after that, but never the same way. I choose spots with exit routes now, trust my unease without needing proof, and respect the spaces between sounds as much as the sounds themselves. The knocks and whispers didn't follow me home, but the lesson did, etched into my understanding of what needs to be out there and how quickly the line between legend and lived experience can disappear when you stop paying attention. I told myself for a long time that what happened out there ended when the pavement began, that whatever had moved through that basin stayed behind with the dust and the dark. But fear has a way of reorganizing your memory, of surfacing when you least expect it. Weeks later, parked in a crowded campground outside Moab with families laughing and generators humming, I still found myself waking at night to phantom sounds, my heart racing at the imagined pressure of something just beyond the wall. The environment had changed, but my relationship to it had not, and that was the part I couldn't ignore. I tried to reason it away the way I always had: stress, isolation, the mind amplifying uncertainty. Those explanations worked during the day when the sun flattened shadows and noise created a sense of safety. At night, though, when the RV settled and the campground quieted, I'd catch myself holding my breath, listening for rhythms that didn't belong. That's when I realized the experience had shifted something fundamental. It wasn't just fear of the unknown anymore. It was distrust in my own tendency to rationalize danger until it stood too close to escape. The following month, I headed north into central Idaho, drawn by a need to test myself, to prove that one bad night hadn't rewritten who I was. I chose a remote Forest Service campground tucked along a river canyon, a place with spaced-out sites and a reputation for solitude. The ranger I spoke to at the station warned me about recent disappearances of solo hikers, said it casually, like a weather update. I nodded, signed the log, and told myself that awareness was enough, that preparation could compensate for risk. The first evening there was uneventful. The river carried sound through the canyon, like masking smaller noises, and the air smelled of pine sap and cold water. I felt grounded again, anchored by familiarity. That illusion cracked just after midnight when a sound cut through the rush of water, sharp and rhythmic, coming from the tree line. It wasn't a knock this time. It was a scraping, like wood dragged slowly across bark, followed by a pause that felt deliberate. My skin prickled, every nerve alert, and I found myself cataloging the differences between this moment and the last one, searching for reasons not to be afraid. The scraping repeated, closer now, and with it came a faint vocalization, low and strained, like someone trying to speak through clenched teeth. I told myself it was an animal, that cougars and elk make sounds that can unsettle even seasoned campers. I stayed seated, hands flat on the table, grounding myself in physical sensation. The smell returned then, not as strong as before, but unmistakable, drifting through the cracked window. It triggered an immediate response, a spike of dread that bypassed logic entirely. This time I didn't wait. I killed the lights, grabbed my keys, and started the engine without hesitation. The sound of it seemed to enrage whatever was out there. The scraping turned into heavy footfalls, circling the RV, and the vocalization sharpened into something that almost resembled a name. That was the moment panic took full control, flooding my system with adrenaline and narrowing my focus to escape. I didn't look for confirmation. I didn't try to understand. I pulled out, tires spinning on gravel, headlights slicing through trunks and undergrowth as I followed the road out of the canyon. I drove until dawn again, heart pounding, hands aching from gripping the wheel. When I finally stopped at a rest area, the sun was just cresting the hills, painting everything in soft gold. In that light, the fear eased enough for reflection to take hold. I realized that the common thread in both experiences wasn't a specific place or sound. It was my insistence on pushing past intuition in favor of pride, my need to frame every warning as a challenge rather than information. In the months that followed, I began to talk to other solo campers, to listen more than I spoke. I heard variations of my own story in theirs, unexplained sounds, figures at the edge of vision, moments where the environment seemed to test their boundaries. Some laughed it off. Others had stopped camping alone entirely. What struck me was how often the danger wasn't an immediate attack, but a slow erosion of certainty, a pressure that made you doubt your perceptions until you made a mistake. I still camp alone now, but I do it differently. I arrive earlier, leave before dark if something feels off, and I don't dismiss the first sign of unease as weakness. The wilderness hasn't changed. It's still vast, indifferent, and capable of beauty that takes your breath away. What's changed is my understanding of my place within it. I've learned that courage isn't staying put when fear whispers at you from the dark. It's recognizing when the line between resilience and recklessness has been crossed and choosing to step back before the environment decides for you. Those cryptic knocks and whispers didn't turn me away from the road. They refined my relationship with it. They taught me that the unseen dangers of solo wilderness camping aren't always predators or myths given form. Sometimes they're the quiet, persuasive voices inside you that tell you to ignore your instincts, to prove something to an empty landscape that doesn't care. Out there, listening can be the difference between a story you carry with you and one that ends without a witness. Even now, when I think back on those nights, what unsettles me most isn't the sounds themselves, but how carefully they seem timed, as if the wilderness understood the rhythm of a person alone. It never came crashing in all at once. It waited until I was tired, until my guard softened, until confidence crept back in wearing the mask of experience. That patience felt intentional, and accepting that changed the way I moved through these places. I began keeping a journal after that, not to document mileage or scenery, but to record moments of hesitation. Small things. A campsite that felt wrong for reasons I couldn't articulate, a silence that lasted a little too long, a smell that didn't belong. Writing it down forced me to acknowledge patterns I would have otherwise ignored. I noticed how often the first sign appeared early, subtle, and easy to dismiss, long before fear announced itself loudly enough to demand action. One entry stands out. Late autumn, northern Arizona, a dispersed site tucked among junipers. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs, the sky painfully clear. I parked, stepped out, and immediately felt a pressure behind my eyes, a sensation I'd come to recognize. Nothing happened. No knocks, no whispers. Just that internal resistance, the quiet suggestion that this wasn't a place meant for rest. I left within 10 minutes. As I drove away, relief flooded in, sharp and unmistakable. That was when I understood that escape doesn't always require pursuit. Sometimes the danger lies in staying long enough for doubt to override instinct. The stories people tell around campfires often focus on the spectacular, on monsters or sudden violence, because those are easier to frame and easier to fear. What I learned out there is more uncomfortable than that. The unseen dangers are patient. They operate in the margins of attention, nudging you toward decisions that favor ego over survival. They don't need to break down your door if they can convince you to open it yourself. I still love RV camping. I still believe in the power of solitude and the clarity it can bring. But I no longer confuse isolation with control. The wilderness doesn't owe us understanding or fairness. It offers space, and within that space, it reflects back who we are when no one is watching. For me, that reflection exposed a stubbornness I'd mistaken for strength. When people ask why I keep going back after everything I've experienced, I tell them the truth. Because fear, when listened to properly, is instructive. It sharpens your awareness. It teaches humility. It reminds you that survival isn't about proving how long you can endure discomfort, but about recognizing when discomfort is a warning rather than a test. Those cryptic knocks and whispers were never just external threats. They were conversations between my instincts and my pride, played out in places where consequences don't announce themselves ahead of time. I learned to decode them not by uncovering some hidden truth about the wilderness, but by finally trusting the quiet voice inside me that said, "This is far enough." And that lesson stays with me every time I turn the key, roll into another stretch of empty land, and let the night close in. I listen more now. I leave sooner. I respect the unseen. Because out there, the most dangerous thing you can do is convince yourself you're immune to fear, when fear might be the only thing trying to keep you alive. The painted hills don't look like they belong on this planet. When the sun hits those ridges of ochre, gold, and deep bruised crimson, it feels like you've wandered into a fever dream or a watercolor painting left out in the rain. I've been living out of my 1994 Winnebago for 3 years now, chasing quiet, but there's a specific kind of quiet in Eastern Oregon that feels less like peace and more like a held breath. I pulled into a dispersed camping spot a few miles outside the official monument boundaries, just as the light was turning honey thick. I like the solitude, but as I leveled the rig, I noticed something that broke the horizon. About 30 yards from my door, someone had built a series of small, meticulously balanced stone cairns. There were dozens of them. They weren't the usual hiker markers you see on a trail. These were narrow, impossibly tall, and arranged in a perfect, tight circle. I remember thinking how much effort it must have taken to balance them in this wind. The air out here doesn't just blow, it hums. It's a low-frequency vibration that rattles your molars. As I was hooking up my gray water tank, a truck pulled onto the access road. It was an old, beat-up Ford, the color of dried mud. It slowed as it passed my sight. The driver, a man with a face like crumpled parchment, leaned out the window. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. He just looked at the circle of stones, then at me. "Don't move 'em," he said. His voice was sandpaper, barely rising above the wind's hum. "I wasn't planning on it," I replied, wiping grease onto a rag. "Local art project?" He spat out the window, his eyes darting to the red hills behind me. "It's not art. It's a weight. Keeps the ground from shifting when the wind starts talking. You hear a whistle that sounds like a name, you get inside that tin box of yours and you lock the deadbolt. You understand?" I gave him a tight, polite nod, the kind you give someone you think is deep into a break with reality. He lingered for a second longer, his gaze fixed on a specific cairn topped with a piece of white quartz that looked like a serrated tooth. "I saw a map of this place once," he muttered, almost to himself. "In the old ranger station before it burned. The trails didn't go where they do now. Some places, they don't want to be on paper." He drove off without another word, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the air far longer than it should have. I dismissed him as a local eccentric. You meet them everywhere in the high desert, people who have spent too much time under the sun and not enough time talking to other humans. I went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat by the window to watch the sunset. That's when the static started. It wasn't coming from the radio. I'd turned that off. It was a physical sensation, a prickling of the skin, like the air was being ionized before a massive lightning strike. I looked out at the hills. The red stripes were deepening into a color that looked uncomfortably like drying blood, and the stones, the cairns, seemed to be vibrating. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. It was an optical illusion, surely. Heat rising from the ground creates a shimmer, but as the light faded, the sound changed. The hum of the wind began to pitch upward, turning into a rhythmic, pulsing whistle. Helu, Helu. It sounded like someone trying to whistle through a broken tooth. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. The thermometer on my dash read 78 degrees, but I could see my breath misting in the air of the cabin. I reached for the door handle, intending to go out and double-check my stabilizer jacks, but I stopped. My hand froze an inch from the metal. Outside, the cairns weren't just vibrating anymore. In the twilight, it looked like they were leaning, not falling, leaning. All of them angled toward the Winnebago, like a crowd of thin, necklace people craning their heads to see inside my window. I pulled the curtain shut. My heart thumped a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It's the geography, I told myself. The minerals in the soil, the way the canyons funnel the air. It's geological, not personal. I sat at my small dinette table and pulled out my laptop, hoping to distract myself with some photo editing. I needed to see something familiar, something I'd captured through a lens. I opened a folder of photos I'd taken earlier that day, shots of the leaf strata at the Painted Hills. As I scrolled through the raw files, I noticed a glitch. Every third or fourth image had a vertical line of static running through it. And in the background of a wide-angle shot of the valley, there was a shape. It was faint, a smudge of gray against the vibrant red clay. It looked like a tripod or a very tall, very thin person standing perfectly still. I zoomed in. The pixels blurred, but the shape remained distinct. It wasn't a person. It was a structure. A tall, wooden tripod with something dangling from the center. It looked exactly like the surveyor's gallows I'd read about on a creepy paranormal blog years ago, a post that had been deleted by the host site for spreading disinformation about national park boundaries. I looked back at the window. The whistling was louder now. It didn't sound like Helu anymore. It sounded like my name. Elias. Elias. I haven't told anyone my name since I left Bend 4 days ago. I stood up, my knees shaking. I had to get out of here. I didn't care about the gray water hookup or the leveling blocks. I just needed to start the engine and drive until I hit pavement and streetlights. I crawled into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine turned over, a healthy, reassuring roar. But as the headlights cut through the darkness, they hit the circle of stones. They weren't 30 yards away anymore. They were 5 feet from my bumper. The circle had closed in, and the white quartz stone, the one that looked like a tooth, was sitting directly on the hood of my van, right against the glass of the windshield. There was no way a person could have moved those stones so quietly. There was no way they could have moved them at all without me hearing the crunch of gravel. I sat there, paralyzed, the engine idling, the headlights illuminating the impossible. The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. Then something tapped on the driver's side window. Tap, 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 tap. A human rhythm, a polite, searching knock. I didn't look. I couldn't. I kept my eyes fixed on that white stone on my hood. In the glare of the headlights, I noticed something carved into the quartz. It wasn't a word. It was a symbol, a circle with 3 vertical lines crossing through it, like a claw mark. I'd seen that symbol before. It was etched into the bottom of a lead-lined box I'd found in a burnt-out basement in the Olympic Peninsula 2 years ago. Back then, I thought it was just graffiti. The knocking started again, but this time it wasn't on the window. It was coming from underneath the floorboards. Tap, 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 tap. Something was under the rig, something that knew exactly where I was sitting. I looked at the dashboard. The GPS was spinning in slow, clockwise circles. The map showed me in the middle of a lake that hadn't existed for 10,000 years. The screen flickered, the blue light casting long, distorted shadows across the cabin. "Elias," a voice whispered. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from the vents. "Elias, you moved the weight." "I didn't touch them," I screamed at the empty air. "I didn't move anything." "The shadow moved," the voice replied. It sounded like my mother's voice, but stretched out like a tape being played at the wrong speed. "The shadow is a movement. You're standing on the fold, Elias. Don't look at the hills." Naturally, I looked. The headlights were still on, and in the distance, the painted hills were no longer red. Under the moonlight, they were turning a pale, necrotic gray, and they were moving. The ridges were shifting, sliding over one another like the folds of a massive, waking brain. The Winnebago began to tilt. I felt the back tires sinking, not into mud, into something that felt soft, like settling ash. The engine groaned and stalled. The headlights flickered and died, leaving me in a darkness so thick I could feel it against my eyeballs. In the sudden blackness, the smell hit me. It wasn't the scent of sagebrush or dry earth. It was the smell of old, wet paper. The smell of a library that had been underwater for a century. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling over the plastic casing. When I finally clicked it on, the beam hit the passenger seat. Sitting there, perfectly balanced on the upholstery, was a single small cairn of red stones. I hadn't opened the door. The windows were locked. The stones were cold. I could feel the chill radiating off them from 3 feet away. And then, from the darkness behind me, from the small hallway that led to the bed, I heard the sound of a page turning. Slowly, deliberately. I turned the flashlight toward the back of the van. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dust motes and landed on the small dinette table. My field journal was open. I had not touched it since I crossed the border from Idaho, yet the pages were flipping as if caught in a localized gale. They stopped on a sketch I did not remember making, a frantic charcoal rendering of the very hills outside with a series of lines connecting the peaks into the shape of a rib cage. The smell of wet paper intensified, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. I swung the light toward the back bed, expecting something. I did not know what. A squatter. A shadow. There was no one there. But the blankets were pulled back. The indentation on the mattress was fresh, as if someone had just stood up. And there, right in the center of the pillow, sat another stone. This one was a flat piece of dark shale, perfectly level, with a small pile of red dust heaped on top of it. I backed away, my heel catching on the edge of the driver's seat. My mind screamed at me to rationalize this. Vibrations. Harmonic resonance can move small objects. The wind is creating a vacuum, but the logic felt thin like a veil being shredded. The tapping started again. This time it was on the roof. Clack, 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 clack. It sounded like bone on fiberglass. It moved from the front of the RV toward the back, heavy and rhythmic. Whatever was up there was not a bird or a stray branch. It had weight. It had intent. As it passed over the center vent, the plastic housing creaked under the pressure, and a fine dusting of red clay fell onto the floor. I lunged for the ignition again. Start, damn you. Just start. I cranked the key. The starter motor whined, a pathetic mechanical plea, but the engine would not catch. The battery gauge on the dash was plummeting, the needle sweeping towards zero, as if something were siphoning the electricity straight out of the laid plates. Then the radio flickered to life. It was not playing music. It was a broadcast of static, but the static had layers. Within the white noise, I could hear voices. They overlapped in a chaotic tapestry of emergency broadcasts, old weather reports, and what sounded like someone reading a list of names in a monotone. Mile marker 42. Conditions are unfavorable. Do not stop for the lights. A burst of high-pitched feedback made me wince and drop the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, the beam rolling under the kitchen cabinet and illuminating nothing but the accumulated dust of 1,000 miles. In the half-light, I saw the passenger seat again. The cairn I had seen moments ago was gone. In its place was a damp patch on the fabric, shaped vaguely like a handprint. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice felt small, swallowed by the upholstery. "I have a flare gun. I'm calling the police." The radio hissed in response. The overlapping voices vanished, replaced by a single, clear signal. It was a woman's voice, calm and professional, like a GPS navigation system. "In 200 feet, turn around. You are heading toward a memory that has been redacted. Please remain stationary while the weight is recalibrated." The Winnebago gave a violent lurch. The back end lifted, then slammed down. I heard the sound of metal screaming, the stabilizer jacks snapping off like toothpicks. I was being moved. Not driven, but dragged. I scrambled to the window and peeled back the curtain just a fraction. The headlights were still dead, but the hills themselves were glowing with a faint bioluminescent silver. It was not light, it was the absence of shadow. The circle of stones was no longer on the ground, they were floating. The cairns were suspended in the air, about 3 feet off the gravel, rotating slowly around the Winnebago in a silent gravitational dance. The white quartz tooth led the procession, bobbing up and down like a buoy in a dark sea. I watched, mesmerized by the sheer impossibility of it, until I realized the direction of the rotation. They were spinning counterclockwise, faster and faster. And as they gained speed, the interior of the RV began to change. The wood grain paneling on the walls began to peel back, but there was no metal behind it. There was only more red clay. My home, my sanctuary, was being unmade. The stove, the sink, the photographs of my life were all being coated in a fine, rust-colored silt that seemed to manifest out of the very air. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was cold, so cold it felt like a burn. I spun around, my back hitting the steering wheel, my breath hitching in a silent sob. The man from the Ford truck was standing in the narrow hallway of my RV. He looked different now. His skin was not just wrinkled, it was cracked, the fissures filled with the same red dust. His eyes were gone, replaced by smooth, polished orbs of white quartz. He was not breathing, he did not have a pulse. He was just a vessel. "I told you," he whispered. This time, the voice didn't come from his mouth. It came from the air around him, vibrating in the walls. The stones are the weight. Without the weight, the map resets. He held out a hand. In his palm sat a small brass compass. The needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning frantically, a blurred circle of silver. "Look at the map, Elias," he said. He pointed to the wall where I'd pinned a topographical map of the John Day fossil beds. The paper was changing. The lines of the trails were shifting, crawling across the page like ink-black worms. New landmarks were appearing, structures that didn't exist: the sunken chapel, the archive of breath, the third fold. "I don't understand," I choked out, my back pressed so hard against the horn that it should have been blaring, but the Winnebago remained silent. "I just wanted to stay the night. I didn't move the stones." "Your presence moved the shadow," the man said. He stepped closer, his movements stiff like a marionette. "The hills remember everything that has ever died on them, every leaf, every bone, every thought. They are heavy with it. We build the cairns to keep that weight from spilling over. But you brought something with you." "I didn't bring anything." "You brought a camera," he said, and for the first time I heard a hint of malice in the wind. "You tried to lock the hills into a frame. You tried to make them stay still. The hills hate being watched. They hate being remembered correctly." He reached out and touched the camera bag sitting on the dinette. The leather hissed and began to smoke. "The blog you read," he continued, "the one about the gallows, that wasn't a story. That was a warning from the last person who sat in this seat. He's still out there in the gray ridges. He's part of the strata now. A thin line of carbon between the gold and the red." The man began to dissolve, not into mist, but into sand. He crumbled from the feet up, a pile of dry, ancient earth collapsing onto my linoleum floor. As his head vanished, the last thing I saw were those quartz eyes, reflecting the silver glow of the hills. The RV was tilting further back now. The nose was pointing toward the stars. I could hear the frame groaning, the screws popping out of the ceiling like bullets. I had to get out. I didn't care about the floating stones or the voices. I lunged for the passenger door and threw myself out into the night. I didn't hit gravel. I hit something soft and yielding. It felt like jumping into a pile of flour. I scrambled to my feet, my lungs burning as I inhaled a cloud of fine red dust. I looked back at the Winnebago. It was gone. There was no van. There were no tire tracks. There was only the empty, silver-lit expanse of the high desert. The circle of stones was there, though. They were back on the ground, perfectly still, perfectly balanced. But the circle was smaller now. Much smaller. And I was standing right in the center of it. I turned around looking for the road, but the horizon had changed. The hills weren't where they were supposed to be. They were surrounding me, a 360-degree wall of rippling gray clay. The whistling returned. Helu, Helu. Only now it wasn't one voice. It was thousands, a choir of broken teeth. I reached into my pocket, my fingers searching for my phone, my keys, anything. My hand closed around a hard, cold object. I pulled it out. It was the white quartz stone, the tooth. It was warm now, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic heat that matched the beating of my own heart. I looked down at my feet. The ground wasn't clay anymore. It was white. I was standing on a floor of bleached bones. Thousands of them, crushed into a fine powder that stretched as far as the silver light could reach. "Don't move the stones," I whispered, the words tasting like copper. I looked up at the ridges. A figure was standing on the nearest peak. It was tall and thin and held a surveyor's transit to its face. Behind it, a wooden tripod stood against the sky, a noose swaying in a wind that didn't exist. The figure waved. Not a friendly wave, a slow, beckoning motion. I didn't run. I couldn't. My feet were heavy as the hills. I felt my skin beginning to itch, a dry, tightening sensation. I looked at my hands. They were turning the color of ochre. I'm still here. I think. I've started building a new cairn. It's the only way to keep the ground from shifting. If you're reading this, if you find this journal in the dust near the Painted Hills, please don't look at the photos. They aren't what you remember. And whatever you do, Do not move the stones. The transition from being a person to being a part of the landscape is not a sudden snap. It is a slow, rhythmic erosion of the self. I sat in the center of that stone circle for what felt like hours, or perhaps it was decades. Time in the Painted Hills doesn't move in a line. It pools in the valleys like heavy fog. I watched the sun rise, but it wasn't the sun I knew. It was a pale, flickering orb that cast long, geometric shadows across the bone-white floor. My Winnebago was still missing, but its ghost remained. I could see the shimmering outline of it in the air, a heat haze in the shape of a vehicle, vibrating with the ghost echo of a radio that only played the sound of a heart stopping. I realized then that I wasn't just standing on the ground. I was being pulled into it. The red dust had climbed past my ankles, a warm, suffocating weight that felt like 1,000 tiny hands pulling at my skin. Every time I tried to lift a foot, the ground groaned, a deep, tectonic protest that vibrated in my chest. Tap, 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 tap. The sound was coming from inside my own skull now. I looked down at the quartz tooth in my hand. It was no longer a stone. It had become translucent, like a cataract removed from a giant's eye. Inside the cloudy depths of the mineral, I saw a reflection. It wasn't my face. It was a map, the same shifting, impossible map from the ranger station. I saw a tiny, blinking red dot. It was moving along a trail marked the path of the unwitnessed. And then I saw the other dots, hundreds of them, all stationary, all arranged in a circle. I looked up at the figure on the ridge, the surveyor. He hadn't moved, but the tripod behind him was now draped with something. It looked like a tattered, sun-bleached flag, but as the wind caught it, I realized it was a collection of clothing, a flannel shirt, a pair of hiking boots, a camera strap. My camera strap. "You're calibrating," I whispered. My voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It sounded like the wind through a canyon. I felt a sudden sharp urge to protect the circle. The man in the truck, he wasn't a warning. He was a predecessor. He was the one who had kept the weight before me. And now, the weight was mine. I reached out and touched one of the stones in the circle. It was a piece of yellow jasper, smooth and cold. As soon as my finger made contact, a memory that wasn't mine flooded my mind. I saw a woman in 1954 standing in this exact spot, screaming at a sky that had turned the color of a bruise. I felt her terror as her station wagon was swallowed by the silt. I saw the way her wedding ring turned to dust on her finger. Then the memory shifted. I saw a group of men in the 1880s driving wooden stakes into the ground, trying to measure a valley that refused to stay the same size. I felt their madness as the compass needles began to spin. The stones weren't markers, they were anchors. Each one held down a moment in time that the hills were trying to digest. I understood then the surveyor's gallows. They weren't for hanging men. They were for hanging the truth. They were structures built to suspend reality just high enough off the ground so that it wouldn't be contaminated by the shifting clay. I began to work. I didn't think about it. My hands just moved. I gathered the smaller stones, the bits of basalt and shale that had been spat out by the moving ridges. I began to build. I stacked them with a precision I'd never possessed in my real life. I balanced them on their thinnest edges, defying gravity, guided by the humming in my teeth. The whistling grew louder, more melodic. It was a lullaby now. Sleep, Elias. Stay, Elias. Be the weight, Elias. I saw a car in the distance. A modern SUV, bright blue and gleaming with the hubris of the paved world. It was winding its way down the access road toward the monument. A young couple was inside. I could see the flash of a smartphone through the windshield. They were coming to take pictures. They were coming to capture the beauty. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run toward them and tell them to turn around, to go back to the world where colors stayed within their lines. But as I opened my mouth, only red dust came out. I looked at the quartz tooth. It was glowing brighter now. The red dot on the map, the one that was me, was fading. It was turning from red to ochre, matching the color of the hills. The blue SUV slowed as it approached my circle. I stood perfectly still. To them, I wasn't a man anymore. I was just another formation. A tall, thin pillar of weathered stone, perhaps slightly more humanoid than the others, but easily explained away by the imagination. The girl in the passenger seat pointed at me. She rolled down the window. "Look at those cairns," she said, her voice clear and terrifyingly real. "Who do you think builds those? It's so creepy, but kind of beautiful, right?" "Probably just bored hikers, Sarah," the guy replied. He pulled over, the tires of the SUV crunching on the gravel. He reached for his camera. I felt the hills tense beneath me. The silver glow began to pulse. The wind started to whistle. Hee-loo! Hee-loo! The guy stepped out of the car. He looked at the circle. He looked at the tall, narrow pillar of stone standing in the center, the pillar that used to be Elias. He walked closer, his brow furrowing. He saw the white quartz stone resting at the top of the stack. "That's a cool piece of quartz," he muttered. He reached out his hand. "Don't," I thought. The thought was a landslide, a roar of falling rock inside my mind. "Don't move the weight. If you move the weight, the shadow follows." His fingers brushed the stone. The world tilted. The blue SUV didn't disappear. It didn't scream. It just blurred. The edges of the vehicle began to soften, the metal turning into something that looked like wet cardboard. The young man's face went slack, his eyes widening as he realized his feet were no longer touching the ground. The stones began to float. I felt a sudden, violent release. The weight was no longer mine. I was being pulled upward, toward the surveyor on the ridge, toward the gallows and the gray sky. I looked down and saw the young man taking my place. I saw his skin beginning to crack, the fissures filling with red dust. I saw his smartphone fall to the ground, its screen flickering with static before being buried by the shifting silt. I was becoming the wind. I was becoming the whistle. As I ascended, I looked back at the valley one last time. The map in the quartz stone had reset. A new red dot was blinking in the center of the circle. The painted hills are beautiful in the twilight. They look like a painting left out in the rain. But paintings don't breathe. Paintings don't hunger. If you go there, stay on the boardwalks. Don't trust the GPS. And if you see a circle of stones, perfectly balanced and humming in the wind, don't stop to take a picture. The desert echoes, but not always in the direction you expect. Sometimes the echo is the only thing left of you. I can see you now. You're looking at the ridges. You're wondering why the red looks so much like blood. Wait. Don't reach for that stone, please. The weight is so very heavy. I knew something was wrong the moment the road went quiet behind me. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles after a long drive, but the kind that feels like the world has deliberately stopped paying attention. My name is Eli Mercer. I was 34 then, a local in the broad American sense, born in the Central Valley, raised on highways and repair shops. The kind of person who learned early that solitude was easier to manage than people. The Volkswagen was a 1987 Westphalia, beige once, now sun-faded into a color that only existed on old maps and tired memories. It had belonged to my father before it belonged to me, and driving it felt like following grooves already carved into my life. I wasn't chasing adventure that week. I was running from noise, emails, conversations that circled without landing anywhere, expectations I never agreed to but still carried. So I pointed the van north, past Reading, past the places that still pretended to be towns, until the road narrowed and the trees began to close ranks. The RV park didn't announce itself so much as reveal itself accidentally. A crooked wooden sign, half swallowed by moss, read Cedar Hollow. The paint was peeling in long vertical strips, like the sign was shedding skin. No flags, no banners, no cheerful promises of amenities, just a gravel entrance curling inward, disappearing into trees that stood too close together to feel welcoming. I hesitated with my blinker on, engine idling, listening to the soft mechanical ticking under the dashboard. Every sensible part of me said to keep driving, but it was late afternoon, the light already thinning, and I was tired in that bone-deep way that makes decisions feel heavier than they should. I turned in. The campground was small, a loop road, 8 pads, maybe 10. Most were empty. Three long-term trailers sat at uneven angles, their skirting cracked, belongings spilling out as if the occupants had stopped caring where things ended up. No kids' bikes, no dogs, no music. Just wind brushing the tops of the pines and the faint creak of aluminum cooling. I chose a spot near the edge, backing in so the van faced out. My father's rule echoed automatically. Always give yourself an exit. The ground felt too soft underfoot when I stepped out, spongy despite the dry weather. The air smelled wrong. Pine? Yes, but under it something sour and metallic, like water that had been standing too long. While I leveled the van, someone cleared his throat behind me. He hadn't made footsteps. That should have bothered me more than it did. He introduced himself as Russell. Late 50s, maybe older. Lean in a way that suggested he ate because he had to, not because he enjoyed it. He said he was the caretaker, gesturing vaguely toward a trailer near what looked like an old pump house. His eyes didn't quite settle on my face. They drifted as if tracking something just behind me. "Staying the night?" he asked. "Just one," I said. He nodded. "That's usually how it starts." I smiled, unsure if he was joking. He didn't smile back. He took my cash, no receipt, no clipboard, and before walking away said, almost casually, "If it gets quiet later, don't let it bother you. And if you hear things after dark, best to stay put." "Hear what?" I asked. He paused, hand on the door of his truck. "People think forests go to sleep at night. They don't. They just stop pretending." Then he drove off, leaving a ribbon of dust that hung in the air longer than it should have. I told myself he was eccentric. Campground types often were. I cooked dinner as the sun slid down behind the trees, the van filling with the familiar smells of propane and canned chili. Familiarity helped. The little rituals of camping always did. As darkness settled, the campground emptied itself of sound. No generators, no radios. Even the insects seemed to thin out. By 10, the silence felt engineered. I sat on the step of the van, boots on gravel, listening. There was no distant highway hum, no airplane passing overhead, just my own breathing and the faint ticking of cooling metal. The smell had grown stronger, carried on pockets of air that moved without wind. It made the back of my throat tighten. That was when I heard the first knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was a careful sound, like someone testing whether something was hollow. 3 slow taps somewhere to my left. I turned, scanning the trees, expecting to see a branch falling or a raccoon knocking over debris. Nothing. I waited, counted. The forest held its breath with me. The second knock came from farther away, same rhythm, same restraint. Answered by a third, closer this time. A pattern forming, not random, not natural. My skin prickled, that old instinct stirring, the one I had learned to doubt over the years in favor of rational explanations. I went inside the van and slid the door shut, the sound louder than it should have been. I locked it, even though I told myself that was unnecessary. I lay on the bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening as the knocks faded into something else. Voices. Low. Overlapping, not words yet, just the suggestion of them, like hearing a conversation through water. They drifted through the campground, weaving between trailers, brushing past the van without touching it. I caught the rise and fall of speech, the cadence of familiarity. It sounded communal, intimate. And then one voice separated itself. It laughed. The sound was dry, broken, like it hadn't been used in a long time. It scraped against my nerves like pulling memories I didn't want into the open. The voices shifted, drawing closer, the sound of movement now undeniable. Gravel crunching, something dragging. I reached for my phone. No signal. The battery indicator dropped from 60 to 50 in the space of a few seconds. My pulse thudded in my ears, loud enough that I wondered if it could be heard outside. A shadow passed the window. It wasn't shaped right. Too tall, too narrow. It paused, head angled toward the glass, and I had the overwhelming sense that whatever it wasn't curious, it was waiting. A hand brushed the side of the van, not struck, not grabbed. Just rested there, palm flat, fingers spread, as if feeling for warmth. I closed my eyes and stayed very still, clinging to the thin hope that if I didn't react, I would be dismissed as uninteresting. The hand lingered, then slid away, leaving the metal colder than before. Eventually, the sounds receded. The voices dissolved back into the forest, carrying that laughter with them like an echo that refused to die. I did not sleep. When dawn finally arrived, it felt reluctant, gray light seeping through the trees rather than flooding them. I stepped outside, stiff and hollow, scanning for signs of what I had experienced. There were no footprints, no marks, no evidence that anything had touched the van at all. Russell stood by the pump house watching me. "Most people leave after the first night," he said. I looked at the road, then back at the campground. Something about leaving without understanding felt wrong, like turning my back on a lesson that hadn't finished speaking yet. "I'll stay one more," I said. His eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something like relief. "Suit yourself," he replied. "The park remembers who listens." And as he turned away, the sour smell thickened in the air, and the forest leaned in a little closer, as if pleased with my decision. I spent the daylight hours trying to convince myself that the night had been a distortion, something my mind produced when left alone too long with its own echoes. I cleaned the van twice, wiped down surfaces that were already clean, reorganized cabinets that had never bothered me before. Busy hands kept panic from gaining a vocabulary. The campground looked ordinary in the sun, almost apologetic. The long-term trailers sagged quietly, their windows dulled by dust. I noticed details I'd missed before. One trailer had children's stickers peeling off its back window, faded cartoon animals smiling through years of neglect. Another had a mailbox mounted crookedly beside the door, its flag permanently raised. No names, no numbers, just empty signals. I walked the loop slowly, counting my steps, grounding myself in the physical world. Gravel under boots, heat on my neck, the smell still lingered, strongest near the tree line behind the furthest pad. The earth there was darker, disturbed, as if it had been turned over repeatedly and never allowed to settle. Flies hovered low, persistent despite the dry air. I told myself not to dig. Around midday, a new van pulled in. A blue Sprinter, clean, modern. 2 people climbed out, laughing easily. A woman with her hair pulled back tight, eyes sharp and observant. A man with a camera slung around his neck, already scanning the trees like they were part of a composition. They introduced themselves as Lauren and Pete, late 20s, from Portland. Weekend trip. They asked if the place was nice. I hesitated, measuring words the way you measure weight on a cracked bridge. "Quiet," I said. "At night." They laughed, pleased. Quiet was what they wanted, too. As afternoon stretched on, I noticed Russell watching them from a distance. Not openly, just enough to register. His truck idled near the pump house longer than necessary, then shut off. He never approached them, never warned them. That evening, the air cooled fast, too fast. I cooked early, appetite gone, and sat inside the van with the door cracked, listening as Lauren and Pete set up across the loop. Their voices carried, bright and human, cutting through the growing stillness like a promise the night would not keep. By the time the sun dropped fully, the campground had changed again. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing down on sound rather than replacing it. Even Lauren and Pete's conversation softened, their laughter shortening as if they were unconsciously conserving something. The first knock came just after 9. It started near the tree line this time, not cautious, not exploratory. A single sharp rap answered immediately by another farther off. Then another. The pattern wasn't rhythmic. It felt conversational, like call and response. Lauren's voice cut through it, asking Pete if he heard that. I felt a spike of guilt then, sharp and immediate. I should have said something earlier. I should have told them to leave before dark. The rationalizations I had leaned on all day collapsed under the weight of shared risk. I stepped out of the van and walked toward them. They were standing close together now, their lantern casting harsh light that seemed to flatten the space around them. Pete's camera hung forgotten at his chest. Lauren looked relieved to see me, that relief curdling quickly when she saw my face. "This happened last night," I said, keeping my voice low. "You should pack up, now." Before either of them could respond, the voices rose. clearer this time, closer to language, though still wrong in shape. They threaded between the trees, overlapping, crowding each other. I heard pleading tones, familiar ones, someone calling out for help in a voice that almost sounded like my sister's. Lauren's eyes widened. "That's not funny," she said, to no one in particular. The lantern flickered. From the far end of the loop, a figure stepped into the light. Then another, and another. They didn't move like people approaching. They drifted, their motions smooth and unsettling, as if the ground offered no resistance. Their faces were indistinct, features blurring when I tried to focus on them, but their posture was unmistakable, upright, intent. Pete reached for his camera, then froze as one of the figures spoke his name. Perfectly. His breath hitched. "How do they know that?" The knocking returned, louder now, surrounding us. It reverberated off the trailers, off the van, off my chest. Lauren grabbed Pete's arm, nails digging in. Panic spread through her body in visible waves, denial collapsing into something more honest. "We need to go," she said. "Right now." A scream tore through the night from the far side of the campground. Not Lauren. Not Pete. It came from one of the long-term trailers, sharp and sudden, cut off almost immediately. The figures shifted at the sound, drawn to it like iron filings to a magnet. That was the opening. I ran for my van, shouting for them to follow. Gravel sprayed as I yanked the door open, keys already in my hand. The engine turned over on the first try, a small mercy I did not take for granted. Headlights flared, cutting through the figures, revealing too much and not enough all at once. Their outlines fractured in the light, edges shimmering as if they were struggling to hold a single form. Lauren and Pete reached their van just as hands reached for them. Not grabbing, guiding. I slammed the accelerator, pulling forward, angling the headlights toward the exit. Lauren's engine roared to life behind me, then stalled. My heart lurched, figures converged, their voices rising in urgency, losing their careful restraint. Pete shouted something I couldn't hear over the noise. The sour smell flooded the air, thick enough to taste. I threw the van into reverse, skidding back toward them, headlights sweeping. One of the figures recoiled, its shape thinning, dissolving at the edges. Lauren tried again. The engine caught. We drove. The loop blurred, trailers streaking past, knocking echoing like gunfire. At the exit, Russell stood in the road. He didn't move. For a fraction of a second, I considered stopping, asking him what this place was, why he stayed, why he watched. Then I saw his expression. Not surprise, not fear. Acceptance. I swerved around him, tires clipping the edge of the road, van lurching hard enough to throw me against the door. Lauren followed, her headlights wild in my mirror. The figures surged behind us, then stopped at the edge of the campground, as if bound by an invisible line. The moment we hit pavement, the sounds cut off. Just like that. We didn't stop driving until the sky began to lighten, the forest thinning into familiar roadside shapes. At a gas station miles away, we finally pulled in, engines ticking, bodies shaking with delayed shock. Lauren cried quietly, face in her hands. Pete stared at nothing, lips moving as if replaying a moment he couldn't escape. None of us went back. Later, after statements and questions and the kind of polite disbelief that feels like dismissal, we parted ways. I drove south, the van humming beneath me, familiar and steady. I still think about Cedar Hollow, about Russell, about the trailers that never emptied themselves. Some places don't trap you with walls or gates. They wait until you decide to stay. They listen for the moment you doubt yourself. I don't doubt myself anymore. And when the road goes quiet behind me now, I take that as a gift, not an invitation. I drove until my hands stopped shaking, then kept driving anyway, because stopping felt like admitting the night had earned a permanent place inside me. The road south unspooled under the headlights, familiar enough to anchor me, unfamiliar enough to keep me alert. Every sound the van made felt amplified. Every shadow at the edge of the beam carried a suggestion I refused to follow. I did not turn on the radio. I needed to hear the engine, the tires, the proof that the vehicle I trusted was still obeying physical laws. At a turnout near dawn, I finally pulled over. The sky was thinning from black to gray, the kind of in-between light that makes everything look unfinished. I stepped out, stretched, and immediately felt how exhausted I really was. Not just tired, hollowed out, like something had pressed against me from the inside and left an impression. I checked the van. No damage, no scratches, no marks where hands had touched. But when I ran my palm along the side panel, the metal felt colder than it should have, as if it had not fully returned to the day. I didn't camp again that night, or the next. I drove home, parked the Westfalia in my driveway, and sat inside it long after the engine was off, listening to the normal sounds of my neighborhood. Dogs barking, a car passing, someone laughing 2 houses down. Ordinary noises felt unreal for a while, like a set I had stepped back onto after wandering too far off stage. For weeks, I told myself that was the end of it. But places like Cedar Hollow don't close the door just because you leave. They stay with you in smaller ways, quieter ones, in moments when you hesitate for no obvious reason, in the way your body reacts before your thoughts catch up. I started researching, careful at first, then more obsessively. Old forum posts, archived campground listings, mentions buried deep in comment sections. Cedar Hollow appeared and disappeared across decades, always slightly misnamed, slightly relocated as if it resisted being pinned down. There were stories, enough to form a shape, campers who stayed longer than planned, caretakers who weren't on any payroll, long-term residents who arrived with families and slowly became singular. Reports filed and quietly closed. People described hearing voices they trusted too quickly. Sounds that felt personal before they felt threatening. A pattern emerged. The park didn't take everyone. It didn't need to. It kept the ones who ignored the first warning their own instincts gave them. The ones who believed endurance was the same thing as strength. The ones who thought discomfort was something to be pushed through rather than listened to. I thought about Russell often, not with anger, with something closer to pity. He had made a choice at some point, I was sure of that, to stay, to watch, maybe to believe that proximity equaled control, or that familiarity dulled danger. People convince themselves of many things when the alternative is admitting they waited too long to leave. Months passed, life resumed its shape, work, conversations, the illusion of normal progression. I took shorter trips, stayed in busier places. I learned the difference between quiet that heals and quiet that hunts. Then, late one evening, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Lauren. She said she'd found me through a mutual acquaintance, that she hoped it wasn't strange to reach out. Pete had sold his camera gear, stopped traveling. Nightmares, she said, the kind that start before you're fully asleep. She asked if I ever still heard things. I stared at the message for a long time before answering. I told her the truth, that I didn't hear voices. Not exactly, but sometimes, when everything else fell away, when the world went still in that deliberate way, I felt watched again, not followed, remembered. She replied almost immediately, said she felt it too. That sense that something had taken note of them, the way you notice a landmark as you pass it, not because you plan to return, but because it's now part of your mental map. We agreed on one thing without discussing it directly. We would never go back. Not to Cedar Hollow. Not to places like it. We would trust the moment unease arrived instead of waiting for proof. Proof we both understood now always came too late. I still drive the Westfalia. I still camp. But I no longer chase silence blindly. I don't mistake emptiness for peace. When a place feels like it is listening more than it should, I leave before nightfall, no matter how inconvenient it feels, no matter how foolish it might look to someone else. Fear, I learned, isn't always an enemy. Sometimes it's the most honest guide you have, the only part of you that hasn't learned to negotiate with danger. There are RV parks across the country that look just like Cedar Hollow did. Hand-painted signs, quiet loops, a promise of rest tucked just far enough from the road to feel earned. Most of them are harmless. Some of them are not. The difference is rarely visible. It lives in the air, in the way sound behaves. in the way your body reacts before your mind starts making excuses. If you ever find yourself somewhere that feels too still, where quiet presses instead of soothes, don't wait for a reason to justify leaving. Don't stay just to prove you can endure it. Endurance is not wisdom. Listening is. I learned that lesson the night the forest spoke back, and I am still here because I finally listened. The first thing I felt wasn't fear. It was the weight of silence pressing down on the windshield like a held breath. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 38 that summer, living out of a weather-beaten Volkswagen Westfalia I'd rebuilt with my own hands after a divorce that left me allergic to walls and routines. I grew up in Oregon, learned early that solitude could either heal you or hollow you out, and I'd convinced myself that the long, forgotten roads were where the truth lived. The maps never warned you about those roads. They were thin gray veins slipping off the interstates, unlabeled, uncelebrated, leading into places most people drove past without noticing. I sought them out on purpose. I told myself it was because they were quiet. The truth was I didn't trust places that were easy to find. That trip took me east, chasing a string of old campground recommendations passed around hushed tones online. No official sites, no reservation systems, just coordinates and half-finished sentences. Don't stay past dark. Listen for the knocks. If you smell copper, leave. Urban legends, people called them. Campfire nonsense dressed up for the internet. I'd read worse, shrugged harder, and kept driving. By the time I turned off the paved highway onto a narrow Forest Service road in northern New Mexico, the sun was already dropping behind the mesas. The road wasn't marked. No sign, no gate, just a break in the scrub where the asphalt gave up. My tires crunched over gravel that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. I remember thinking that was a good sign. Fewer people meant fewer problems. That was always my logic. It had failed me before, but I kept using it anyway. The air changed as soon as I crossed that threshold. The temperature dipped, not dramatically, but enough that I rolled up my sleeves and felt goosebumps rise. The smell came next. Dry earth mixed with something metallic like old rainwater sitting in a rusted barrel. I cracked the window, then closed it again. The engine noise felt too loud, too intrusive, like I was interrupting something that had been ongoing long before I arrived. I drove for nearly 40 minutes without seeing another vehicle, another person, or any sign that the road was meant to be used. It twisted through shallow canyons and stands of juniper, the headlights catching eyes that vanished the moment I focused on them. Probably deer. Probably coyotes. I said that word, probably, out loud, like a charm against unease. When I finally found the clearing, it looked less like a campground and more like a place people used to leave in a hurry. A circle of fire-blackened stones sat off-center, weeds growing through the ash. An old wooden post leaned nearby, whatever sign it once held long since gone. No tire tracks, no footprints, just wind dragging itself through the brush with a sound like distant breathing. I parked the VW facing outward, habit drilled into me after too many close calls. As I killed the engine, the silence rushed in, thick and immediate. No insects, no birds, just that wind moving unevenly as if it had to work to get through the clearing. I told myself this was normal. High desert quiet. Animals bedding down. My rational built a scaffold of explanations while another part of me, the part I'd learned to ignore, kept scanning the tree line, counting shadows, measuring distance to the driver's seat. I cooked a simple meal on the tailgate, beans and rice eaten straight from the pan. The food tasted flat, like my tongue had gone numb. As darkness settled, the temperature dropped faster than expected. I pulled on a jacket and noticed then how still the air had become. The wind had stopped entirely. The smell of metal returned, stronger now, clinging to the back of my throat. That's when I heard the first knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't close. It came from somewhere beyond the clearing, a hollow sound like wood tapped gently with a knuckle. One knock. Then nothing. I froze with the spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. 10 seconds passed. 20. My heart sped up anyway, filling the silence with its own noise. I laughed once, short and forced, and said, "Tree branch," even though there were no trees close enough to explain it. I cleaned up quickly, every movement sharper than it needed to be. When the second knock came, it was closer. Same sound. Same deliberate spacing. Not random. Not natural. I stood there in the dark, my breath fogging, staring into a wall of black where the road disappeared. I didn't call out. I didn't turn on more lights. Something about the sound told me it wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to be acknowledged. Denial is a powerful thing. I've relied on it my whole life. I told myself people played pranks, hunters knocked wood together, old camps made noises when they cooled. I told myself every explanation except the one my body was offering freely. Leave. Instead, I climbed into the VW and locked the doors. I lay back on the bench seat, staring at the ceiling, listening. Minutes stretched. My ears strained until they hurt. I began to catalog every sound, the soft tick of cooling metal, the fabric shifting as I moved, my own breathing, too fast, too shallow. The third knock came from behind the van. This one was unmistakable. Close enough that I felt it in my chest. Not against the vehicle, but near enough that the distinction didn't matter. My mouth went dry. I slid toward the front seat, keys already in my hand, and that's when something brushed the side of the van. Not scraped, not struck, brushed, slow, exploratory. I held my breath, counting without realizing it, waiting for the sound to move on. Instead, it circled. The smell intensified, sharp and coppery, seeping through the seals, making my eyes water. My thoughts fractured. Images flickered, stories I'd read, comments dismissed, warnings I'd scrolled past with a smirk. Another knock, this time on the metal. I snapped. Fear burned through denial like paper. I turned the key, the engine coughing once before roaring to life, headlights flooding the clearing. For a split second, I saw movement at the edge of the light, something tall, wrong in its proportions, retreating too smoothly to be human. Then it was gone, swallowed by dark. I didn't wait. I threw the van into gear and sped back down the road, gravel spitting, heart hammering so hard I thought I'd black out. The road felt narrower now, closing in, every shadow a threat. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw headlights that weren't mine, pacing me without sound, but when I looked again, there was only darkness. I drove until the sky began to pale, until the smell faded and the silence loosened its grip. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles from nowhere, fluorescent lights buzzing like a benediction. I sat there shaking, hands locked on the wheel, understanding finally what those legends were meant to do. They weren't warnings about monsters. They were reminders about listening, about trusting the part of yourself that notices when the world goes quiet in the wrong way. This wasn't the end of that road for me. It was only the first time I understood how close I'd come to not leaving at all. I stayed in that gas station parking lot until the sun was fully up, watching the cashier through the glass as if proximity to another human might anchor me back into something normal. When I finally stepped out of the van, my legs felt weak, rubbery, like I'd just climbed down from a height I hadn't realized I was standing on. The smell lingered in the upholstery, faint now but unmistakable, copper and dust. Fear has a way of soaking into fabric. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not the cashier. Not the older man filling his truck at the next pump who nodded at me like we were part of the same unspoken fraternity of early risers. I bought bad coffee and a breakfast burrito I couldn't finish, then got back on the road, telling myself I just needed distance. That's what I always told myself. Distance fixes things. Time smooths the edges. Memory dulls the blade. By noon, I'd crossed into Colorado, climbing into higher elevations where the air thinned and the temperature stayed cool even under a clear sky. I rolled the windows down, letting pine-scented air wash through the van, trying to overwrite the night before. The road signs became familiar again. National forest boundaries, campground symbols, trailheads with names that showed up on actual maps. Civilization, even in its thinnest form, felt reassuring. That should have been the end of it. One bad night. One lesson learned. Avoid the unmarked roads. Trust your instincts sooner. Move on. But there's a particular arrogance that comes with survival, a quiet voice that says, "You handled it. You got out. You understand now." That voice can sound a lot like confidence, and confidence can get you killed just as easily as ignorance. I stopped that afternoon near an old forest road outside Pagosa Springs, one recommended by a local I met at a grocery store. He was in his 60s, sun-leathered, eyes sharp. When I asked about dispersed camping spots, he hesitated, then scribbled directions on the back of a receipt. "Stay on the road," he said, not looking at me. "If you hear anyone calling after dark, don't answer." I smiled like it was a joke. He didn't smile back. The road he sent me down was narrow but maintained, cutting through dense pine forest that blocked out the sky in places. The light dappled the hood of the VW, shadows sliding like water. I noticed the temperature drop again, sharper this time, and the smell, pine, damp earth, something sweet and rotten underneath. Decomposition, life feeding on itself. I found a pull-off near a creek just before dusk. Water moved fast over rocks, constant and loud enough to mask smaller sounds. That felt like protection. Sound meant life. Sound meant nothing could sneak up on me unnoticed. I set up quickly, more cautious now. No fire, lights low, doors locked. I ate inside the van, engine off, radio silent. As night settled, the forest came alive with noise. Crickets, distant owls, the rush of water. My shoulders loosened. This was the world I understood. This was the soundtrack I trusted. Then slowly, the sounds began to thin. It didn't happen all at once. The insects quieted first, one by one, like lights going out along a hallway. The creek remained, but even it seemed muted, as if something were pressing down on the air. I checked the time. Just after 10. Too early for that kind of stillness. I told myself animals sensed predators. Mountain lions passed through, bears wandered close. That explained it. It always explained it until it didn't. The first voice drifted through the trees from upstream. "Hey," it called, soft and uncertain, stretched thin by distance. "Hey, can you help me?" My chest tightened. The voice sounded young, male, strained like someone trying not to panic. Every instinct I had screamed not to respond. Every lesson I'd ever learned about the wilderness echoed in my head. People don't wander lost at night without light, without gear, without making more noise. The voice came again, closer now. "I know you're there." I stayed silent, barely breathing. The creek's rush felt suddenly insufficient, too easily parted by that voice sliding through it. My mind raced, searching for explanations that didn't involve what I was already thinking. Maybe it was real. Maybe someone was hurt. Maybe this was the test, whether fear would turn me into the kind of person who ignored another human in need. The smell returned, creeping through the van's vents. Sweet. Metallic. Wrong. "Please," the voice said, now close enough that I could hear the catch in its breath. "I can't find the road." I clenched my jaw until it ached. The voice was wrong. The cadence off. Too even. Too practiced. Like it had learned how to sound scared without actually feeling it. A shape moved between the trees, just beyond the reach of my headlights. Tall. Thin. It stopped when I flicked the lights on, then shifted sideways, never stepping fully into view. My heart hammered so hard I worried it would give me away. "Caleb," the voice said. I don't remember reaching for the keys. I just remember the engine roaring, headlights blazing, and the shape recoiling, retreating upstream with impossible speed. The voice changed then, dropping the pretense, flattening into something empty. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, fading into the dark. I drove that night without direction, without plan, until exhaustion forced me to pull into a rest area along the highway. I parked under a light that buzzed and flickered, the sound grating but grounding. I didn't sleep. I watched the tree line instead, replaying the night in my head, over and over, searching for the moment I could have chosen differently. By morning, something had shifted inside me. The fear was still there, but it had shape now. Purpose. These weren't isolated incidents. These roads, these forgotten places, they shared something. A pattern. They preyed on the same weakness, the belief that solitude is harmless, that quiet is safe, that curiosity outweighs caution. I learned to listen differently after that, not just to sounds, but to absence, to smells that didn't belong, to the way my body reacted before my mind caught up. I stopped chasing the unmarked roads. I stopped romanticizing isolation. I learned that some trails are forbidden not because they're dangerous to walk, but because they don't let go once they've noticed you. There is one more stretch of road I need to tell you about, the one where panic finally broke into something sharper, and escape came at a cost I still carry. That's where this story turns from warning into reckoning. I didn't plan to take that last road. That's the lie I told myself afterward, because intention implies choice, and choice implies responsibility. The truth is, I drifted into it the way people drift into bad decisions when they're tired of running and even more tired of pretending they've learned enough. A week passed after Colorado. I stayed close to populated campgrounds, paid sites with posted rules and numbered spaces. I slept better, but not well. Every night, I woke to phantom sounds, knocks that weren't there, voices that dissolved the moment I focused on them. Fear had learned my rhythms. It knew how to wait. I crossed into Utah under a sky so wide it felt oppressive, the land flattening out into long, empty stretches where the road ran straight for miles and the horizon never seemed to get closer. That kind of openness can make you feel exposed, like there's nowhere to hide, even when there's nothing chasing you. I told myself I'd push through to Nevada, keep moving, end the trip early if I had to. Then I saw the sign. It wasn't official. No reflective paint, no standardized font, just a slab of weathered wood nailed to a post at a crossroads where the highway narrowed and dipped toward Red Rock Hills. No name, just an arrow and the words "scenic route" burned deep enough that time hadn't erased them. I slowed without realizing it. My hands tightened on the wheel. My mind supplied a dozen rationalizations in quick succession. Daylight, clear weather. I wouldn't camp. I just drive it, see it. Prove to myself that I wasn't being controlled by a few bad nights and a head full of stories. I turned. The road descended immediately, the temperature climbing as the land closed in around me. Rock walls rose on either side, close enough that the sound of my engine bounced back distorted, unfamiliar. The smell hit me next. Hot stone, dust, something old and dry, like a room that hadn't been opened in decades. There were no pull-offs, no side roads, just a single lane winding deeper, the sky shrinking to a ribbon overhead. I told myself I'd turn around at the next widening. There wasn't one. After 30 minutes, I realized something else was wrong. The road surface hadn't changed. No fresh asphalt, no repairs, just the same cracked pavement, uninterrupted. No debris, no tire marks, like nothing else used this road. Like it existed only to be driven once. The radio crackled to life without warning, a burst of static that made me flinch. I hadn't turned it on. I reached to shut it off, but before I could, a voice slipped through the noise. Not words, breathing. Slow, measured, too close. I slapped the radio off, heart racing, palms slick. The silence afterward felt heavier than before, pressing in from all sides. The rock walls seemed closer now, the lane narrower, the van suddenly too large for the space it occupied. That's when the road began to slope downward more sharply, curving out of sight. My stomach dropped with it. Every instinct I had told me to stop, to turn around, to do anything but continue. But there was nowhere to turn, no shoulder, no break in the stone. I descended into shadow. The temperature dropped fast, like I'd crossed an invisible threshold. My breath fogged the windshield. The headlights illuminated shapes carved into the rock, markings I couldn't place, too deliberate to be erosion, too crude to be art. Lines and circles and tall, thin figures etched over one another, layered with age. The smell of copper returned, stronger than ever. I began to feel watched, not from one direction, but from everywhere. Above, behind, inside the van itself. My thoughts scattered, logic fraying under the weight of that awareness. I whispered to myself without realizing it, grounding phrases, fragments of memory, anything to anchor me to the present moment. Then the knocking started. Not outside this time. From beneath the van, a dull, rhythmic thud rising through the floorboards, traveling up my legs and into my chest. Each knock spaced evenly, patient, expectant. No, I said aloud, my voice thin, unconvincing. No, no. The van shuddered as if something shifted underneath, weight redistributing. The engine strained, RPM spiking, though my foot hadn't moved. The headlights flickered, then steadied, illuminating the road ahead where it leveled out into a wide basin. In the center stood something I couldn't immediately understand. At first glance, it looked like a rest stop. A structure of wood and stone, low and rectangular, roof sagging with age. No lights, no signs. Just a building squatting in the basin like it had grown there. Around it, the ground was bare, scrubbed clean of vegetation, the dirt packed hard and smooth. I didn't stop. I tried to drive past, but as the van crossed the basin's edge, the engine died. Everything went silent at once, the suddenness of it making my ears ring. I turned the key. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. The knocking stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps, slow, unhurried, circling. I didn't look out the windows. I knew better by then. Looking made things real in ways that couldn't be undone. I stayed rigid in the driver's seat, every muscle locked, every sense straining. A voice spoke from directly beside my door. Calm. Familiar. You're tired, it said. My voice, my exact cadence. You can rest now. Something brushed the handle. Panic surged, raw and overwhelming, shredding the last of my restraint. I kicked the door open and bolted, sprinting away from the van toward the open basin, lungs burning, vision tunneling. The air was freezing, sharp enough to hurt. The ground felt wrong beneath my feet, too smooth, offering no traction. Behind me, I heard movement, not footsteps, but sliding, gliding, like something being dragged across stone. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing hard, pain flaring through my knee. I rolled onto my back, gasping, and finally looked. They stood at the edge of the basin, multiple shapes now, tall and indistinct, faces blurred as if my eyes refused to focus. They didn't advance. They didn't need to. They watched. And in that moment, something inside me shifted again. Not fear this time, but clarity. This place didn't want my body. It wanted my permission. I forced myself to stand, every movement deliberate, every instinct screaming. I turned my back on them and walked. Not ran, back toward the van. Each step felt like defiance, like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd been giving away. The engine started the moment I touched the door. I didn't question it. I got in, slammed it shut, and drove. The basin vanished behind me, the road rising, the temperature climbing, the rock walls pulling back as if nothing had happened. When I reached the highway, the sun was setting, the sky painted gold and red like an apology. I never found that road again. I've tried. Maps don't show it. Locals deny it. Satellite images blur the area into meaningless shapes. But I carry it with me. I learned something there, something every camper, every traveler, every person who seeks solitude needs to understand. Some roads are forbidden not because they lead somewhere terrible, but because they offer you the chance to stop choosing, to give in, to rest, to disappear quietly. Survival isn't about strength. It's about refusal. This is the final stretch of the story. If you want, I can close it with the reflection that came afterward, the lesson that stayed, and why I still drive a Volkswagen into the quiet places, but never without listening first. The first time I realized the woods could listen back was the night my Volkswagen fell silent and the dark didn't. I still remember the exact second the engine died. Not stalled, not coughing, just stopped, like it decided it had carried me far enough and wanted no part of what waited ahead. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was thick, heavy, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you become aware of your own breathing and then start to resent it for being too loud. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, headlights cutting into a tunnel of pine and dust, telling myself this was what I came for. Solitude, distance, space to think. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 36 at the time, born and raised in Northern California, the kind of guy who learned to camp before he learned to drive. I wasn't reckless, and I wasn't chasing thrills. I'd rebuilt that old Volkswagen Type 2 with my own hands over 6 years. New seals, tuned carburetor, rewired the electrical system twice because I didn't trust shortcuts. That van wasn't a toy, it was a promise, a way to move through the country slowly, honestly, without hiding from where I was. That trip took me into southern Utah, miles off the interstate, toward a dispersed campground I'd marked from an outdated Forest Service map. No reservations, no amenities, just a clearing near a dry riverbed ringed by juniper and scrub pine, the kind of place that doesn't exist unless you're looking for it. The locals at the last gas station had warned me in half jokes and half glances not to stay out too long after sunset. I laughed it off, because that's what you do when you've spent your life believing preparation is the same thing as control. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dropping, turning the rocks into long shadows that stretched toward me like fingers. I parked the van facing outward, an old habit, set the handbrake, and shut everything down. That's when the quiet really settled in. No highway hum, no wind, no insects, just stillness so complete it felt staged. I told myself it was normal. High desert does that sometimes. I cooked a simple meal on the tailgate, watched the sky bleed from orange into violet, and felt that familiar mix of pride and humility that comes from being alone somewhere big. But even then, there was an unease I couldn't name. Not fear. More like the sense that I was early to something I didn't understand. The first sound came after dark. It wasn't loud. That's what bothered me. It was a soft, irregular tapping, wood on wood, maybe, somewhere beyond the reach of the lantern. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause longer. It didn't follow a pattern I could predict, which made my mind work overtime trying to assign it one. Branches settling, I decided. Temperature change, animals brushing against deadfall. All reasonable explanations, stacked neatly so I wouldn't have to consider anything else. I climbed into the van, slid the door shut, and lay back on the thin mattress I had installed myself. The smell of old vinyl and dust was familiar, grounding. My fingers brushed the cool metal of the door latch, and I remember thinking how absurd it would be to lock myself in out of nerves. I didn't. I left it as it was, cracked open a fraction for airflow because I didn't want to admit even to myself that I was uneasy. The tapping stopped. In its place came something worse. A sound like breathing. Not close enough to feel, not loud enough to locate, but present. An uneven exhale carried on the air, as if the darkness itself had lungs. I held my breath without realizing it, listening harder, straining until my chest ached. When I finally inhaled, the sound matched me, too closely. I sat up, heart beginning to accelerate, and waited for the rational explanation to arrive like it always had before. It didn't. Instead, there was a shuffle in the dirt. Slow and deliberate, circling. I could hear small stones shifting under weight, stopping every few steps as if whoever or whatever was moving wanted to be certain I was still there. My mind went straight to animals again. Coyotes, mule deer, maybe a lost cow. But none of those move with hesitation. None of them test the ground like they're thinking. I whispered out loud, "Get it together," because silence felt dangerous now, like consent. The lantern flickered once, then steadied. That tiny malfunction sent a jolt through me. I checked the battery with shaking hands, angry at myself for letting nerves take over. Fear has a way of humiliating you before it ever threatens you. It makes you question your own competence, your own history, everything you've used to define yourself as capable. That's when I heard the knock. One firm rap against the side panel of the van. Not metal settling, not wind. A knock. My body reacted before my thoughts did. Muscles locked, skin prickled, a cold spread through my hands that had nothing to do with the desert night. I stared at the metal wall inches from my face, watching my own shadow tremble against it, and waited for the follow-up that would confirm I hadn't imagined it. It came. Slower this time, more deliberate. Knock. Knock. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had closed completely, and every instinct I'd ever had was screaming that acknowledging the sound would turn it into something real. Instead, I reached for the keys hanging from a hook by the dash, wincing at the faint jingle they made. The shuffle outside stopped instantly, like whatever was out there had been listening for that exact noise. That was the moment suspicion crept in, Not fear yet, but the sharp awareness that I was no longer alone in a passive way. Something was responding to me, adjusting. A voice floated through the dark. Mark? It stretched my name, bent it slightly, like someone trying on a word they weren't used to. The accent was wrong. Too careful. Too empty. My heart began to hammer so hard I could feel it in my ears, and with it came the most dangerous impulse of all: denial. I wanted so badly to believe it was another camper who'd wandered over, someone who needed help, someone human enough to explain everything. But no one should have known my name. I hadn't signed in anywhere. I hadn't told the gas station clerk where I was headed. The van had no identifying decals, no plates visible from the road. My name existed only in my own head and in that voice outside, floating between the trees as if the night itself had spoken it. Mark, it said again, closer now. You okay in there? Every survival lesson I'd ever learned collided in that instant. Trust your instincts. Help when you can. Don't escalate. Don't reveal yourself. I sat frozen, trapped between the man I believed myself to be and the animal part of my brain that understood something was profoundly wrong. The smell of dust and oil in the van suddenly felt suffocating, and sweat gathered along my spine despite the cooling air. The hands slid along the side of the Volkswagen next, fingers dragging lightly across the paint. I could hear the texture of it, the faint rasp of skin against metal. It moved toward the door, toward the latch I hadn't locked. That was when panic finally broke through. I lunged forward and slammed the lock down, the click echoing in the van like a gunshot. Outside, the movement stopped. No voice, no footsteps, just silence again, wider, heavier than before. I sat there shaking, keys clenched in my fist, realizing with absolute clarity that whatever was out there now knew I was afraid. And that I was trapped inside a machine that might not start. The silence that followed the lock clicking into place was not relief. It was assessment. I stayed perfectly still, counting my breaths in my head because I no longer trusted my body to do it for me. 1, 2, 3. Each inhale felt too loud, each exhale like a confession. Outside, nothing moved. No footsteps retreating, no branches snapping, no muttered curse from someone embarrassed to be caught. Just absence. And absence, I was learning, could be as active as presence. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time had begun to stretch in unfamiliar ways, thinning and thickening without warning. I leaned forward until my forehead rested against the steering wheel, the rubber cool and slightly sticky under my skin, grounding me in something solid and mechanical. I told myself I would wait. That was the plan. Wait until whoever it was got bored. Wait until morning. Wait until my pulse slowed enough to think clearly. Then the smell changed. At first, it was faint, almost imagined, a sharp, organic note that didn't belong to dust or fuel or sun-warmed upholstery. It reminded me of wet fur left too long in the heat, mixed with something metallic like old pennies rubbed between fingers. I lifted my head slowly, testing the air, and the scent grew stronger near the back of the van. My stomach tightened. Smell is a primitive sense. It bypasses logic and goes straight to memory, and this one stirred something old and instinctive in me, a warning I couldn't translate into words. Something brushed the rear bumper. Not a collision. A test. The van rocked just enough for me to feel it through the frame, a subtle sway that told me weight had been applied and then removed. I reached back and flicked off the lantern, plunging the interior into darkness, hoping the lack of light would erase me. The moonlight filtering through the windows was pale and distorted, turning familiar shapes into something alien. Another push came, firmer this time. The Volkswagen creaked in protest, a low groan of aging metal. My pulse spiked again, and with it came a terrible realization. This wasn't someone trying to get my attention anymore. This was someone, or something, testing the limits of what I was inside, learning how much force it would take. Mark, the voice said again, closer now, right outside the driver's door. It had lost the question in it, the pretense of concern. Now it sounded almost patient. You don't have to hide. I squeezed my eyes shut, anger flashing through the fear like static. Anger at myself for coming alone. anger at every video and article that had romanticized solitude without acknowledging its cost, anger at the part of me that still wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding. That anger steadied my hands enough to try the ignition. The key turned. The starter clicked once, then nothing. I waited a heartbeat and tried again. Click. Silence. A low sound came from outside, something between a sigh and a chuckle, and it made my skin crawl because of how out of place it was. Whatever was there seemed to understand what had just happened. The van shuddered again, a slow rocking from side to side now, deliberate enough that I could feel the rhythm of it. I braced my feet against the floor, absurdly afraid that if it tipped far enough, I'd lose control entirely. I reached for my phone, hands clumsy in the dark, and the screen lit up my face in stark white. No signal. Of course. I dimmed it immediately, heart racing at the thought of advertising my position, but the damage was already done. The rocking stopped. The presence shifted. I could sense it moving toward the glow like an animal drawn to fire. There was a pause, then a soft scraping sound as fingers traced the edge of the window, following the glass until they found the seal. I held my breath again, muscles screaming in protest, and watched as a shadow passed over the window, blotting out the moonlight completely. The smell intensified, filling the van until it coated the back of my throat. I don't know why I spoke then. Maybe because silence felt like surrender. Maybe because some stubborn part of me wanted to assert that I was still human, still capable of choice. My voice came out hoarse, barely louder than a whisper. Go away! The shadow didn't move. Instead, the fingers pressed flat against the glass, splayed wide. They were too long. I remember that detail with unsettling clarity, the way they stretched across more of the window than a normal hand should, joints bending at slightly wrong angles. The glass bowed inward under the pressure, and I flinched back, my shoulder hitting the cabinet behind me. You're not listening, the voice said, no longer trying to sound like me or anyone else. It had dropped the mimicry, revealing something raw and hollow underneath. This is where you stopped. That sentence did something to me. It cracked the last layer of denial I'd been clinging to. This wasn't a random encounter. This place, this night, this choice to park here, it all felt suddenly preordained, like I'd wandered into a story that had been waiting for a character willing to believe he was safe. The pressure on the window increased, a faint spider web of stress lines appearing in the corner of the glass. My thoughts raced, scrambling for options. I couldn't outrun it on foot. I couldn't drive away. Fighting from inside the van would be useless. That left one possibility I'd been avoiding since the first knock, leaving the van on my own terms. The idea was terrifying. The van was my shelter, my barrier, my last illusion of control. Stepping outside meant meeting the unknown directly, trading thin metal and glass for open air and vulnerability. But staying meant waiting for the barrier to fail. Another creak sounded from the window frame. I moved quietly, forcing myself to be slow despite the adrenaline flooding my system. I slid the side door handle just enough to disengage it without making noise, my fingers slick with sweat. The desert night pressed close on the other side, cold and vast. I listened hard, straining to locate the presence, but the sounds had gone still again, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. I counted down in my head. 3, 2, 1. I yanked the door open and bolted. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing my breath as my boots hit the dirt. I ran without direction, just away, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might tear free of my chest. Behind me, something moved, not fast, not slow, but with an unhurried certainty that was somehow worse. I could hear it now, the rhythm of its steps wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, never quite matching mine no matter how I changed pace. The ground dipped unexpectedly, and I stumbled, catching myself on my hands and knees. The dirt was freezing, biting into my palms, and for a split-second panic threatened to paralyze me completely. I pushed up and kept going, lungs burning, eyes scanning wildly for anything that could help. A rock outcropping, a tree, light, anything. I didn't realize I was screaming until my throat began to ache. Ahead, the dark shifted, resolving into the pale outline of the dry riverbed I'd parked near. I scrambled down its slope and into the shallow channel, hoping the change in terrain would buy me time. The smell followed me, stronger now, and with it came a sound like amusement, a low vibration that seemed to travel through the ground more than the air. I ran until my legs gave out, until the night blurred at the edges of my vision, until fear became a single focused point. Survive this next second. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pursuit stopped. I collapsed against the bank of the riverbed, chest heaving, listening desperately for movement. Nothing. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Strained, incomplete, as if something had stepped back rather than left. I stayed there for a long time, shaking uncontrollably, afraid that standing would make me visible again. Eventually, the eastern sky began to lighten, a thin gray line cutting through the black. With it came a fragile sense of possibility. I made my way back to the van cautiously, expecting at any moment to see it torn open, but it sat exactly as I'd left it, unmarked and inert, like nothing had ever happened. The engine started on the first turn. I didn't question it. I didn't wait. I drove until the sun was fully up and the road rejoined the world I recognized, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached a town with people and noise and fluorescent lights that felt like sanctuary. That night changed the way I camp, the way I travel, the way I listen. I no longer assume isolation is neutral or that preparation is protection. Some places carry a weight that doesn't announce itself, and some encounters don't leave physical evidence behind. I sat in that town until the sun was high enough to feel warm on my skin. The Volkswagen parked crooked outside a diner I didn't remember choosing. My hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I hadn't tasted once. People came and went around me. Truckers, families, a couple of hikers laughing too loudly, and every ordinary sound felt unreal, like a recording played just slightly out of sync. I kept expecting someone to ask me what had happened, to notice the dirt ground into my clothes, the way my eyes tracked every movement near the windows. No one did. Fear, I learned, is invisible to everyone except the person carrying it. I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I smelled it again, that wet, metallic tang, and felt the way the night had leaned toward me, patient and deliberate. So I drove, north this time, toward places I knew, toward roads I'd traveled before. The van hummed along like nothing had ever gone wrong, and that almost bothered me more than if it had broken down completely. Machines, at least, are honest about their failures. They don't pretend. For weeks afterward, I told myself the experience was a convergence of stress, isolation, and imagination. That's the narrative we're trained to reach for. The one that restores order, puts the world back into categories we can manage. I replayed every moment, looking for the point where logic could be stitched back in. Maybe someone had followed me from the gas station. Maybe I'd dozed off and dreamed the voice. Maybe the fear had exaggerated shadows and sounds until they felt alive. But denial has a shelf life. It expired the next time I camped. This was months later in northern Arizona, a familiar stretch of forest near the Mogollon Rim. I'd chosen it precisely because it felt safe. Maintained roads, occasional traffic, a ranger station within driving distance. I needed to prove to myself that the night in Utah hadn't broken something fundamental in me, that I could still be alone without unraveling. I set up early, cooked before dusk, and locked the van as soon as the sun dipped below the trees, telling myself it was just good practice now, nothing more. The forest settled into its nighttime rhythm, insects chirring, wind moving gently through the pines. It was almost comforting. Almost. Then I noticed the absence. No owls, no coyotes. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if someone had slowly turned a dial down to zero. The air felt heavier, colder against my skin, and a familiar tension coiled in my gut. I sat very still, listening, every sense stretched tight. A footstep sounded behind the van. Just one. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared straight ahead at the dashboard, watching my reflection in the dark glass, half expecting it to look back at me differently. The The step came again, closer this time, the crunch of pine needles unmistakable. I waited for the knock, for the voice, for the smell. None of it came. Instead, there was a whisper, so faint I almost missed it, carried on the air like a thought that wasn't mine. Still running. The words hit me harder than any pursuit, because in that instant, I understood the truth I'd been circling since Utah. This wasn't about a single place or a single night. It was about patterns, about the way certain people move through the world believing awareness is optional, that solitude is passive, that danger announces itself clearly and gives you time to prepare. I didn't stay. I didn't argue with myself. I started the engine and drove until the forest thinned and the sounds returned, my reflection in the windshield slowly resembling a person again. Since then, my relationship with camping has changed in ways that are difficult to explain to people who've never felt the wilderness push back. I still travel. I still camp. But I listen differently now. I choose places with intention, not just beauty. I pay attention to the silences between sounds, to the way air moves or doesn't around a site. I trust the first flicker of unease instead of burying it under bravado. The lesson isn't that the woods are evil or that every shadow hides something waiting to take you. That's clickbait. That's comfort disguised as fear. The truth is more unsettling and more empowering at the same time. Responsibility doesn't end when you turn off the engine. Awareness doesn't stop when the doors close. And safety is not a guarantee. It's an ongoing negotiation with a world that doesn't care whether you're ready or not. That old Volkswagen is still with me. I keep it maintained. I keep it stocked. But I no longer treat it like armor. It's a tool, a thin line between me and whatever exists beyond the reach of light. And when the night grows too quiet, when the forest seems to hold its breath, I don't wait for proof anymore. I leave. Because the real danger of camping isn't what wants to hurt you. It's the moment you convince yourself that nothing ever will. The first night I realized the desert was watching me was the night I stopped trusting silence. I was 36 then, driving a faded orange Volkswagen Westfalia that had already lived more lives than most people I knew. I called her Maribel, mostly because giving the van a name made the loneliness feel negotiated rather than absolute. I had left Portland 2 weeks earlier, heading south and east with no fixed plan, chasing a kind of quiet I could not find in cities anymore. That quiet was supposed to live out here in the remote backcountry of eastern Utah, beyond the reach of cell towers and gas stations, where the map thinned into suggestions instead of instructions. I chose the campsite because it felt forgotten. No reservation system, no marked pads, just a clearing of hard-packed dirt ringed by juniper and low red rock shelves. The nearest paved road was nearly 20 miles away. I told myself that was the point. I told myself isolation was freedom. That was my first lie of the trip. By late afternoon, the sun sat heavy and low, flattening shadows and bleaching the world into harsh clarity. Heat radiated through the steering wheel as I parked, and when I stepped out, the air smelled metallic, like dust warmed too long. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching over gravel that felt older than memory. I was not alone on this trip, not really. My younger cousin Eli had joined me for this stretch, a 29-year-old geology grad student who believed knowledge could tame fear. He arrived in his own battered Subaru an hour later, grinning, sunburned, already talking about rock layers and fault lines as if naming things made them obedient. We set up camp with practiced ease, pop the roof, unroll the awning, arrange the folding chairs to face the open land instead of each other. I cooked beans and canned chili on the small stove. Eli took photos, narrating them aloud, his voice filling the space the desert refused to occupy. As dusk crept in, the temperature dropped faster than I expected. The heat drained away like a held breath released too suddenly. The smell changed too. Less dust, more iron, something faintly sour beneath it, like wet stone, though there had been no rain for weeks. That was when we heard the first sound. It came from somewhere beyond the junipers, a low knocking rhythm, irregular but deliberate. Not loud, not close, but distinct enough to register as intention rather than accident. Eli paused mid-sentence. "Woodpecker," he said quickly, almost reflexively. "There aren't trees big enough," I replied, and I hated how small my voice sounded against the open land. The knocking stopped. Silence rushed back in, thicker than before, pressing against my ears. I waited for the natural follow-up sounds that usually came after you noticed something odd. Insects resuming, wind stirring branches, the world correcting itself. None of that happened. Eli laughed, short and sharp, probably rocks shifting with the temperature drop. Thermal contraction. Happens all the time. I nodded, because nodding was easier than admitting my skin had tightened, like my body recognized something my mind did not want to name. We lit a small fire as night took hold. The sky darkened into an impossible spread of stars, the Milky Way cutting across it like a scar. Normally that sight filled me with awe. That night it felt like exposure, as if we were illuminated from above, while everything below remained intentionally unlit. The knocking returned after full dark. This time it was closer. 3 slow impacts, spaced evenly, followed by a pause long enough to raise hope it was finished. Then 2 quicker knocks, lighter somehow, as if testing. Eli stood up. "I'll check it out," he said, already reaching for his headlamp. "No," I said too fast. "Just stay here." He looked at me, amused. "You scared?" I wanted to say no. I wanted to be the older cousin, the experienced traveler, the one who had camped in snowstorms and desert heat and learned the difference between fear and imagination. But something about that sound bypassed logic. It felt personal, like a signal meant for us specifically. "Just don't wander," I said instead. He moved a few steps away from the fire, scanning the darkness. The beam of his lamp cut across the junipers, revealing twisted trunks and shadows that refused to hold still. No movement, no animals, just rock and scrub and the sense of depth that comes from not knowing where the land stops. Then the smell hit me, sharp, wet, almost sweet, like decay mixed with rain-soaked fur. It drifted in uneven waves, strongest when the knocking resumed, weaker when it stopped. I covered my nose instinctively. "You smell that?" I asked. Eli hesitated. "Yeah, that's not normal." The knocking shifted direction. No longer from the trees, it came from the rock shelf behind the campsite, the sound carrying strangely, bouncing, impossible to triangulate. The rhythm changed too, less mechanical, more exploratory. I felt the ground vibration through the soles of my boots, subtle but undeniable. Whatever was making that sound was not small. Eli lowered his headlamp. "Okay," he said quietly. "That's not rocks." We backed toward the van without discussing it, our movements synchronized by shared instinct rather than plan. I fumbled with the sliding door, hands suddenly clumsy, breath too loud. When we were inside, I slammed it shut harder than necessary, the sound echoing farther than I liked. The knocking stopped immediately. That was worse. Inside the van, the air felt thin, stale despite the cracked windows. The smell lingered, seeping in as if it did not respect barriers. Eli sat on the bench seat, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the glass. "Probably some animal," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Big one, maybe a bear passing through." "There are no bears here," I replied. I had checked. I always checked. We turned off the lantern, plunging ourselves into near-total darkness. The stars outside felt intrusive now, watching through the windows like distant eyes. I lay back, heart thudding against my ribs, counting breaths, waiting for reason to reassert itself. Something brushed the side of the van. Not a scrape, not a bump. A slow drag like fingers testing paint. Eli sucked in a breath so sharp it hurt to hear. The van rocked once, gently, experimentally. I clenched my hands, nails biting into my palms as a thought rose unbidden and unwanted. This thing knows what this is. It knows it can move us. The knocking returned, now right beside us, not against metal or stone, but wood. Someone, or something, was tapping on the pop-top roof. Once. Twice. Then a pause, heavy with expectation. I did not sleep that night. I do not think Eli did either. We stayed frozen, listening to sounds that never fully resolved into certainty, our minds trapped between denial and dread, waiting for morning like it was a promise instead of a question. Morning did not arrive the way I expected. There was no gentle light, no easing of tension, no sense of relief unfolding with the dawn. The sky simply shifted from black to a bruised gray, as if night had loosened its grip reluctantly, leaving its fingerprints behind. I lay still for a long time, listening, afraid that movement itself might invite attention back to us. The desert was quiet again, but it was not the same quiet I had sought when I came out here. This silence felt deliberate, like something holding its breath. Eli finally spoke, his voice dry and thin. "You awake?" "I never slept," I said, and realized it was true in more ways than one. We waited another hour before opening the door. The smell was gone, replaced by cold air that stung my lungs and carried nothing familiar with it. When I stepped outside, my boots sank slightly into the dirt near the van, impressions too deep and too wide to belong to anything that walked upright like us. Eli crouched, running his fingers just above the marks without touching them. "That's not Bear," he said quietly. "The stride's wrong. And look at the spacing." I did not want to look, but I did anyway. The prints curved around the van in an incomplete circle, as if whatever made them had paced, reconsidered, then moved off toward the rock shelf. There were drag marks too, shallow grooves that suggested something heavy had been pulled, or something had leaned close enough to leave its weight behind. "What do you think it was?" I asked. Eli straightened, eyes scanning the horizon. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, his certainty had cracked. "But I don't think it was curious. I think it was checking us." We packed faster than either of us admitted we were capable of. No breakfast, no coffee. The rituals that usually anchored mornings on the road felt foolish now, indulgent. As I collapsed the pop top, my hands shook hard enough that I had to stop and breathe until they steadied. Before leaving, I walked a short distance toward the rock shelf, drawn by a need I could not articulate. The stone face loomed above me, streaked with mineral stains that looked darker in the morning light. Halfway up, where the shelf flattened briefly, I saw something wedged between two boulders, a scrap of fabric, faded blue, frayed at the edges, caught like a warning flag. It looked like denim, torn violently rather than worn thin. I did not touch it. I did not need to. The implication pressed into me, heavy and cold. I turned back to the van without calling Eli over. Some things once shared cannot be contained. The drive out felt longer than the drive in, every mile stretching thin, my eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror. The land unfolded the same way it had yesterday, red rock and scrub and endless sky, but it no longer felt neutral. It felt alert. Neither of us spoke until we reached the paved road. When the tires finally hummed against asphalt, the sound was so ordinary it almost made me cry. We stopped at the first gas station we found, a lonely outpost with peeling paint and a single pump that clanked like it resented being used. Inside, the clerk was an older man with skin like sun-dried leather and eyes that lingered a little too long on our dust-covered clothes. "You camp out past the junipers?" he asked casually, ringing up my coffee. I hesitated. Eli glanced at me, then back at the man. "Yeah," he said. "Just one night." The clerk's mouth tightened, barely perceptible. "Most folks don't stay that long." I waited for him to say more. He didn't. The silence between us thickened, familiar and unwelcome. "Did you hear anything?" I asked finally. The man met my gaze then, really looked at me, and something unreadable passed through his expression. "This land's old," he said. "Older than stories. Sometimes it reminds people of that." We left without pressing him further. Whatever explanation he might have offered, I suspected it would have raised more questions than answers. Eli decided to head back toward Salt Lake City that afternoon. His academic curiosity had been replaced by something more cautious, more human. We hugged awkwardly beside the van, promising to talk soon, though we both knew this was not a story easily shared. I kept driving east. That choice haunts me more than anything else. I told myself it was stubbornness or pride, or a refusal to let fear dictate my movements. The truth was uglier. Part of me wanted to understand. Part of me believed that daylight and distance had stripped the experience of its teeth. By the second night, I was camped alone near a dry riverbed in western Colorado, the land softer here, rolling rather than jagged. Cottonwoods lined the bank, their leaves whispering in a breeze that smelled faintly of water and rot. I set up early, cooked a proper meal, forced myself into routine like it was armor. The unease returned at dusk. Not as a sound this time, but as a sensation, a crawling awareness along my spine that refused to settle. The temperature dropped sharply, and with it came that smell again, faint but unmistakable, threading through the air like a memory I could not suppress. I told myself it was an animal carcass nearby. I told myself my mind was replaying last night's fear, overlaying it onto an ordinary environment. I told myself many things. The first knock came from across the riverbed. It echoed differently here, muted by sand and distance, but the rhythm was the same. Slow. Intentional. I did not wait this time. I climbed into the driver's seat, hands shaking as I fumbled the keys into the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught, the sound absurdly loud in the gathering dark. As I turned the headlights toward the narrow dirt track leading back to the road, something stepped into the beam. It was tall. Too tall. Its outline blurred at the edges, as if my eyes could not agree on where it ended and the night began. The smell intensified instantly, flooding the van, making my eyes water. It did not run. It did not lunge. It tilted its head just slightly, like it was listening to me think. Panic exploded through me then, white and blinding. I slammed the accelerator, the van jolting forward, tires spinning briefly in loose dirt before gripping. The shape did not pursue. It did not need to. In the mirror, I saw it turn away, unbothered, already losing interest. I drove until sunrise, until the land softened into something recognizable, until fear burned itself down to a dull ache. When I finally stopped, parked in a crowded rest area with trucks idling and people moving around me, I sat behind the wheel and cried until my chest hurt. I did not camp again for months after that. When I did, it was different. Closer to towns, surrounded by people, with the quiet broken intentionally, defensively. I learned something out there, something I carry with me every time I slide the door of the van shut and step into the night. The land does not owe us safety. Solitude is not empty. And there are places where curiosity is not rewarded with answers, only with reminders that we are visitors, fragile and temporary, moving through territories that remember every footprint we leave behind. When I hear knocking now, anywhere, even in cities, I pause. I listen. And I trust the part of me that wants to leave before the silence answers back. I did not plan to test that lesson again, but the road has a way of circling back on the parts of you that think they are finished learning. It was late October when I found myself in northern Arizona, chasing cooler air and wider skies, telling myself this was different because I was not alone. Mara sat in the passenger seat, knees pulled up, tracing the map on her phone, even though we both knew there was no signal. She was 42, a former wildfire lookout who had learned the land by watching it burn and recover, and she carried herself with a grounded confidence that made fear feel manageable simply by proximity. "This area's quiet," she said, tapping the screen. "Too quiet for this time of year." I almost laughed. Almost. We parked near a stand of pinyon pines where the ground dipped into a shallow basin. The temperature was already dropping, the kind of cold that seeps rather than strikes, threading itself through layers and settling against bone. The air smelled clean at first, sharp with pine sap and dust, and I let myself believe that maybe the past few months had dulled my nerves into seeing threats where none existed. Mara noticed the way I lingered by the door after shutting the engine off. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, just remembering something. She nodded, accepting that answer without prying. That was her way. Respect the boundary, keep watch anyway. As night settled, the wind picked up, threading through the pines with a sound like low voices just out of focus. Mara brewed coffee on the stove, the smell warm and grounding, and we talked about ordinary things. Jobs we had left, people we had not. The conversation drifted, looped, found its own rhythm. The first disruption was the temperature. It dropped suddenly, as if the basin itself had exhaled. The coffee cooled faster than it should have. The air pressed inward, dense and damp, carrying that now familiar undernote I had hoped never to smell again. Mara stiffened. "You smell that?" I closed my eyes briefly. "Yeah." She did not reach for logic right away. She reached for her jacket, zipped it higher, and scanned the tree line. "That's not rot," she said. "That's animal, but wrong." The wind died, the pines fell silent, needles frozen mid-whisper. Sound did not fade so much as withdraw, leaving behind a pressure that made my ears ring. Then came the footsteps, not rushed, not heavy, just measured compressions of earth, circling wide, deliberate. I could feel them through the soles of my boots, each one a reminder that whatever moved out there did not need to announce itself loudly to be known. Mara reached for my arm, fingers digging in just enough to ground me. "Listen," she murmured. "It's not crossing the basin." She was right. The steps traced the perimeter, testing distance, mapping us without approaching. The intelligence of that movement chilled me more than any sudden charge could have. A sound followed, softer than the knocks I remembered, but worse in its familiarity. A low, breathy imitation of something human, trying to remember how it was supposed to sound. Not a voice. A rehearsal. My heart hammered, each beat loud enough that I worried it might give us away. Mara's breathing slowed, controlled, the way people breathe when panic is acknowledged but not permitted. "We're not prey," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "Not yet." The words landed heavy. The sound shifted closer to the trees, the imitation refining itself, shaping syllables that almost made sense. Almost. My name rose to my lips unbidden, the urge to respond sharp and dangerous, like touching a flame to see if it burned. Myra squeezed my arm harder. "Don't," she said. "It wants calibration." The phrase lodged in my mind. Calibration, adjustment, learning. The van creaked as something leaned briefly against it, not enough to rock us, just enough to announce weight and intent. The smell surged, thick and suffocating, as if whatever it was had pressed close enough for its warmth to bleed through metal and glass. I tasted copper, my mouth dry and sharp with fear. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The pressure lifted, the sound retreated, the smell thinned, trailing off into the cold air like a receding tide. We waited. Minutes stretched, elastic and uncertain. Neither of us moved until the wind returned, tentative at first, then steady, as if reassured. Mara exhaled slowly. "We leave," she said. "Now." No debate. We packed in silence, movements efficient, practiced. When the engine turned over, the sound felt like an intrusion, a declaration we could not take back. The headlights cut through the trees, that illuminating nothing but bark and shadow. As we pulled away, I caught a glimpse of movement between the pines. Not chasing, observing, memorizing. We drove until the road widened and the sky lightened with the promise of morning. When we finally stopped, the world felt ordinary again in the way that only comes after terror loosens its grip. Mara leaned back in her seat, eyes closed. "There are places," she said, "where the rules aren't written for us." I nodded, exhaustion settling deep. "And we keep pretending they are." She opened her eyes, looked at me with something like sympathy. "The trick," she said, "is knowing when to listen." That night changed how I camp, how I travel, how I think about the land I love. Fear did not make me smaller. It made me precise. It taught me to read absence as carefully as presence, to trust the unease that arrives before explanation, to understand that survival is not about dominance, but about respect. I still drive Maribel into the backcountry. I still sleep beneath stars that feel too close for comfort. But I choose my quiet now. I do not chase it blindly. And when the land presses back, when it whispers or knocks or tests the edges of my certainty, I remember this. We are not alone out there. We never were. And the smartest thing a traveler can do is know when to be a guest and when to leave before the night decides to answer.